Have you ever wondered why retiring undefeated from MMA is as rare as seeing an albino crocodile? Unbeatable athletes having their O's taken away is just how this game works. However, what's uncommon is when undefeated fighters, at their prime and at the top of their game, are viciously defeated for the first time when people least expect it. That being said, we will look into the 10 most dramatic ways unbeaten fighters lost. Islam Makhachev. By September 2014, 11 unlucky fellas had tasted the bitterness of defeat at the hands of Islam Makhachev. The UFC matchmakers couldn't ignore such a talent, so they signed the Dagestani prospect to the organization. His close friend Khabib Nurmagomedov was already making waves in the promotion. He was 6-0 at the time and even had a notable victory over the UFC legend Rafael dos Anjos. The UFC was ready to welcome another undefeated Russian who could potentially dethrone the champion in the near future. Makhachev made his UFC debut on May 23, 2015 against Leo Kuntz. This fight wasn't a walk-in-the-park kind of fight for Islam, as he was facing a fighter with a 17-1 record at the time. Nevertheless, the Dagestani prospect had a masterpiece performance, ending Leo's suffering in the second round via a rear-naked choke. However, over 4 months after his debut, Islam was set to lock horns with Adriano Martins, a BJJ black belt who was coming off a big victory against Rustam Khabilov. For some reason, Makhachev decided to stand and bang with the heavy striker, and, well, the Brazilian unleashed a big overhand bomb that sent Islam straight to oblivion. A fun fact related to this is that Adriano Martins never won a single bout after the Makhachev fight. Paulo Costa. Borrachinha is the kind of fighter who beats his opponents as if they owe him money. With the relentless barrage of strikes and unbearable pressure that is impossible to withstand, Paulo Costa was setting the UFC on fire. Since making his promotional debut on March 11, 2017, Costa has run through opposition like a tank over a car, including brutal finishes against Johnny Hendricks and Uriah Hall and a dominant unanimous decision victory versus Yoel Romero. The Brazilian was finally ready for the title and was sure that he could implement the same tactic against then-reigning champ Israel Adesanya. Things obviously didn't go as planned, as Adesanya constantly blasted his leg, turning it literally into ground meat. The torture seminar culminated in the second, when Izzy knocked Costa out and made a not-so-respectful move afterwards. Considering Paulo Costa's downfall ever since this loss, it looks like Adesanya affected the Brazilian more than he could initially imagine. Joanna Jedrzejczyk. Joanna was truly the boogie woman of the UFC's strawweight division, absolutely terrifying inside and outside the cage. The Polish fighter put this women's division on the map by scoring jaw-dropping performances while facing no real resistance. Her Muay Thai background, combined with her good takedown defense skills, made her an elite competitor and a puzzle nobody could solve. Joanna was a master of mind games. She would get into her opponents' faces, then intimidate them, and use every kind of word to break them mentally. Such was the case with Rose Namajunas, who had a not-so-impressive record of 6-3 when going up against the strawweight queen. Considering Joanna had been dominant for so long and had already defended her belt 5 times, it looked like Rose would be another sacrificial lamb given to the champ. Namajunas was a legit grappler who could end a fight on the ground in an instant. However, her game plan was not what people would have expected. She decided to go toe-to-toe with the Muay Thai specialist and had a clear advantage on the feet. The crowning moment arrived early in the first, when Rose landed a rocket on Joanna's face, dropping her down in disbelief. The American proceeded with this tactic, and the second time she dropped the adversary to the canvas, it was all over. Surprises happen in this sport, but beating the undefeated Polish champion in her own game was quite a sight. Carwin. Here is one of those fighters with the nuclear option in his hands. Before facing Brock Lesnar, Carwin was 12-0 as a fighter, with none of the foes surviving to tell the story of the second round. The guy was a tank who was knocking everyone out in the first, which was the same method of victory against Frank Mir for the interim belt. Although he hurt Lesnar early in the first, and it appeared that this would be another first-round KO victory for the American, Lesnar turned the tables in the following round. The exhausted Carwin had no fight left in him, so Brock caught him in a tight arm triangle choke and gave him the option to tap or nap. When fighting at this level of competition, possessing only incredible KO power is clearly not enough. Cain Velasquez. You can't talk about heavyweight greats without mentioning Cain Velasquez. The conversation between heavyweight GOATs is always between Fedor, Stipe, and Cain, and for a good reason. Cain was one of the scariest, most dominant fighters the sport has ever seen. His relentless pressure of striking, mixing it with wrestling, and having an extra oxygen cylinder to support that pace, and Velasquez was terrifying for any heavyweight on the planet. He made easy work of the Pride FC legend Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. knocking him out early in the first, and reminded Brock Lesnar of how the UFC is nothing like the WWE. The American was 9-0 at this time, and was next matched with Junior Dos Santos, a rising star, but not many were giving him the chance to win against the more well-rounded fighter. On November 12, 2011, the two headlined the UFC's debut on Fox. And you know what they say about heavyweights: one punch is all it takes. Velasquez was brutally KO'd in the first, highlighting his first professional loss. Velasquez and Dos Santos met 2 more times in the future, and the American had the last laugh. However, he will never forget who took his 0 away and why staying undefeated for a long time, especially at heavyweight, is almost impossible. Speaking of which, Fedor Emelianenko. Nobody can deny that Fedor Emelianenko is one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, if not the greatest heavyweight ever. Staying undefeated for almost a decade in a division of heavy hitters is not an easy feat. Forget the Tsuyoshi Kosaka loss, which was caused by an illegal elbow that could have resulted in a no contest. The fight was part of the Ring's King of Kings tournament, and one athlete had to advance forward. So despite Fedor never losing that fight, it was gifted to Kosaka as a victory. Nevertheless, it doesn't question the fact that Fedor was unbeaten for a decade, running through MMA legends like Mirko Cro Cop, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Mark Coleman, Andrei Arlovski, you name it. By 2009, Fedor had issued one-way tickets straight to the Dead Sea to 31 unfortunate competitors and was coming off a spectacular second-round KO against Brett Rogers. When he was matched against Fabricio Verdum, it appeared that the Brazilian would be another easy prey for the GOAT. Well, Verdum had different plans that night. He introduced Fedor to the beauty of jiu-jitsu by catching him in a tight triangle and forcing the tap. Even the commentator was losing his mind, screaming, "Fedor Emelianenko, losing for the first time!" Verdum was one of the best heavyweights too, and later became a UFC champion. Nonetheless, most people will best remember him as the man who took Fedor's soul. Sean O'Malley. In his mind, Sean O'Malley is still undefeated, and here is why. By the time he first met Chito Vera on August 16, 2020, he was undefeated with a 12-0 record, coming off 2 performances of the night and 1 fight of the night bonus. Sugar was making a big splash in the UFC and rapidly climbing the rankings. A shot at the title seemed inevitable, and Chito was just another bantamweight who got in the way, right? Well, whether it was caused by a kick or a check, O'Malley's leg got hurt early in the bout. He struggled to keep his balance like a newly born deer. The Ecuadorian fighter seized the opportunity and blasted Sean with elbows before the referee pulled him off. Now, the finish might be considered controversial, but in a sport where causing damage is the ultimate goal to win, nobody should dispute Chito's victory. Thankfully for O'Malley, he later became a champion and even avenged his first and only loss, remaining mentally undefeated. Brian Ortega. A jaw-dropping KO victory against Clay Guida, vicious guillotines against Renato Moicano and Cub Swanson, and of course, an uppercut from hell KO versus Frankie Edgar. This is the story of Brian Ortega going into the title fight against Max Holloway. With a pile of 14 bodies behind him and no loss on his record, T-City was supposed to be the next big thing in the featherweight division. That was until the unlucky Ortega stumbled upon the prime version of Max Holloway, who just beat the king of Rio himself, Jose Aldo, twice. It was one of those fights that is hard to watch. Max Holloway obliterated the challenger with his boxing, making his face look like a Halloween mask. Holloway set a new record for the most significant strikes in a single fight, with 290, and also broke the record for landing 134 significant strikes in a single round. Ronda Rousey. Who can forget how dominant Ronda Rousey used to be? She was the arm collector whose opponents would have been lucky to hear the final bell, let alone winning a fight against her. It wasn't only about winning. None of her opponents except Miesha Tate had even survived the first round. Ronda was breaking the myth that women don't possess the ability to finish fights, and she quickly turned into a superstar. With a record of 12-0, with 9 submissions and 3 knockouts, Ronda was confident she could beat any woman on the planet with one arm. Unfortunately for her, having that superiority complex backfired in the worst possible way. On November 15, 2015, Rousey was scheduled to face Holly Holm, a multiple-time world champion in boxing with deadly striking credentials. For some odd reason, Ronda thought that her striking was good enough to stand against Holm. Ronda's cockiness and overconfidence resulted in a second-round head kick knockout loss by a kick that would make even the great Cro Cop envious. Rowdy learned the hard way that you must never underestimate an opponent when fighting at this level. Ben Askren. Probably the most dramatic way someone's undefeated streak has ended is Ben Askren. The former Bellator and ONE champion was 18-0 when he signed with the UFC, eager to prove that he is UFC material. Funky's wrestling was a complex puzzle to solve, and people who fought him described it as fighting against an octopus. The Olympic wrestler made his UFC debut on March 2, 2019, and had a tough victory against Robbie Lawler. If he only knew that Robbie was just an underboss before facing the final villain in the game. 4 months later, Ben Askren was locked in the cage with Jorge Masvidal, a guy who doesn't need an introduction. The whole spectacle lasted for 5 seconds, as Masvidal went airborne with a knee, shutting Askren's lights off instantly. A Bellator and one legend who was undefeated for much of his career will always be remembered as the fighter who was knocked out in 5 seconds. Next one.